It began in the summer of 1971, in a city that seemed too ordinary to cradle a mystery that would stretch across half a century. Fort Worth, Texas, was a place of quiet routines and confident sunlight, a city caught between the memory of small-town rhythms and the hum of post-war progress. On its east side, narrow streets carried the sounds of lawn sprinklers, cicadas, and the soft clatter of screen doors. On one of those streets, a 21-month-old girl disappeared without a trace. No witnesses, no ransom note, no sign of struggle. Just a void that would echo through decades of hope, grief, and relentless search. Her name was Melissa Turner, a name that would become a headline, a memory, and eventually, a miracle. The morning of August 23rd carried the kind of heat that settles before noon and refuses to lift. Melissa's mother, a 22-year-old waitress, recently separated from her husband, had been trying to rebuild her life. She worked double shifts at a downtown diner, balancing exhaustion against the small joy of seeing her children safe and fed. That morning, she had done what countless parents do and trusted someone she believed would help. The woman who arrived at her door just after 9 was polite, composed, and strangely formal. She wore white gloves, a pale blouse, and a small hat pinned neatly to her hair. She introduced herself as Ruth Johnson, answering a newspaper ad for childcare. She smiled easily, spoke softly, and carried herself like someone who had done this before. The young mother handed Melissa over, kissed her forehead, and watched them disappear down the sidewalk, the sitter's gloved hand steadying the small girl in a white dress with pink trim. When she returned home that evening, the apartment was silent. The curtains shifted in the slow turn of the fan. Melissa's blanket lay folded in the corner of her crib, untouched. Her favorite stuffed rabbit sat upright on the pillow, its button eye catching the last of the daylight. At first, the mother thought there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe the sitter had taken Melissa for a walk or to visit a relative. She called friends, then neighbors. No one had seen a woman in white gloves. No one knew Ruth Johnson. Panic began to sharpen every minute into fear. By the time police arrived, night had already taken the street. Officers searched the small apartment, looking for signs of forced entry. There were none. The locks were intact, the windows undisturbed. One detective noted that the sitter had not been asked for identification, no license, no references, just a voice over a rotary phone and a promise to help. The mother's words broke apart between sobs as she repeated the story. She looked kind, she kept saying. In 1971, an abduction like this was treated differently, often as a misunderstanding, sometimes as a domestic dispute. But as the first 24 hours passed without a single lead, the case shifted from confusion to crisis. A citywide bulletin went out. Female toddler, brown eyes, brown hair, last seen wearing a white dress with pink trim. Patrol cars cruised alleys and bus terminals. Detectives visited train stations, gas stations, and local motels, showing the babysitter's sketch to anyone who would look. The drawing, composed from a mother's shaky description, showed a woman in her mid-20s, oval face, light hair, calm eyes. But calmness was what had deceived everyone. Within days, Melissa's story was front-page news. Toddler vanishes with babysitter. Reporters crowded the narrow street. Cameras flashed against the stucco walls of the apartment complex. The mother stood on her porch holding a photograph, her expression both hollow and defiant. Police issued statements that revealed little. Theories multiplied. A runaway sitter, a child sold, an accident covered up. None would ever fit. As the weeks passed, the neighborhood changed its habits. Porch lights stayed on longer. Mothers held their children closer in grocery aisles. Some neighbors stopped talking to reporters altogether, uneasy with the sudden attention. What had once been an ordinary block now carried the weight of whispered warnings. But the silence that followed was the heaviest thing of all. After the first month, the tips stopped. The phone no longer rang at night. Detectives rotated off the case, then back on again, each time starting from the same blank page. The name Ruth Johnson led nowhere. Too many of them, too few connections. By winter, the story that had once gripped Fort Worth had receded into the margins of the newspaper, below weather reports and council votes. Still, Melissa Turner's mother refused to let the trail die. She kept the child's photograph taped above her dresser, replacing it each year as the paper yellowed. Every birthday, she baked a small cake. Every Christmas, she left one extra present under the tree, wrapped, labeled, and untouched. When she prayed, she never used the word gone, only waiting. As the years crept forward, the case became a relic of an older era, one without cameras, databases, or digital footprints. Investigators retired. Files were boxed, stacked, and shelved. New technology came, but too late for the families who had waited through half a lifetime. Yet time has a way of circling back. Somewhere, the child who had vanished in 1971 was living under another name, unaware of the story that had begun with her. The truth, buried under decades of assumption and loss, would one day find its way back through science, the kind of quiet, mathematical miracle that brings names home to their rightful places. And when it did, 51 years later, the first phone call didn't come from a detective, but from a stranger who shared a fragment of her DNA. By the fall of 1971, the air over Fort Worth had cooled, but the case had already gone cold. Detectives who had once carried Melissa Turner's photo in their wallets now worked other cases. Robberies, assaults, and the endless churn of a city's everyday crimes. But for her mother, time did not move the same way. The calendar turned, the city changed, but every evening ended at the same empty crib. She learned to live beside absence, not past it. In November, she stood once again before reporters. Her voice cracked as she thanked volunteers who had searched the fields and riverbanks for weeks. The words sounded practiced, but they weren't. They were survival, the only form of control left to her. Behind her, a detective from the Missingpersons division promised that the department was still following leads. It was the same phrase he would use for years. A small envelope arrived at the police station that winter. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the case and a note written in neat cursive. "She's alive. You're looking in the wrong place." It was unsigned. The ink was smudged by moisture, the postmark too faint to trace. Investigators called it a hoax. The mother did not. She pinned the note above her kitchen sink, where it stayed for more than a decade. The 70s stretched into routine. Each time the phone rang unexpectedly, hope flared and burned out. Every brown-eyed girl in a grocery line seemed, for a second, to carry a resemblance. The mother's hands grew from years of work and grief. She refused to move from that small apartment on the east side. "She'll come home and need to find me," she told anyone who asked. The city expanded around her, highways cutting through old neighborhoods and new buildings rising downtown. But her world remained the same. 3 rooms and a window that faced the street. By 1978, the police file on Melissa Turner had swelled to hundreds of pages. False leads stacked like sediment, tips from psychics, letters from inmates, and phone calls from strangers claiming knowledge. Each one was investigated, logged, and quietly dismissed. Detectives retired, and new ones arrived, inheriting the same dead ends. One officer, who later wrote an internal memo about the case, called it the most complete absence I've ever worked. In the early 80s, new technology offered glimmers of progress. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was formed in 1984. Age progression sketches became a tool of possibility. One of the first requests made by Melissa's mother was for an age-up portrait of how her daughter might look at 14. The artist's rendering was printed in the local newspaper. It showed a young girl with steady eyes and a faint, half-formed smile. The resemblance to the toddler's photo was haunting. The mother cut out the picture, framed it, and placed it beside her bed. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my girl." But the world had learned to move on faster than grief allows. Each decade dulled the urgency of the search in the public mind. The reporters who had once chased the story now covered elections and weather reports. Missing person files without bodies or suspects rarely found resolution. Even within the department, younger detectives treated the case as folklore, a tragic relic of a time before digital forensics. Still, the mother kept pushing. She called television stations when anniversary specials aired about unsolved disappearances. She appeared on one in 1989, her voice older but unbroken. "I still believe she's alive," she said on camera. "I don't know where, but I feel it." Her words carried no bitterness, only faith so persistent it became a kind of defiance. Melissa's siblings, older now, grew up under the weight of that faith. They learned early that their family's story was unfinished. Each new decade brought another generation of questions. What happened? Who took her? And how could she still be missing? For them, the sister they barely remembered became both a person and a legend. In 1991, the department transferred all pre-digital cold cases to microfilm. Melissa Turner's file of hundreds of photographs, typed reports, and index cards was condensed into a few spools of film stored in a temperature-controlled cabinet. Officially, the case was inactive but not closed. It would take another 25 years before the next real movement. The 90s were an era of new hope for families of the missing. DNA technology was beginning to move from laboratories into law enforcement. CODIS, the federal DNA database, went online. But to use it, you needed evidence, something that could be swabbed, sequenced, or matched. Melissa's case had none. No crime scene, no biological samples, no objects left behind, just paper and photographs. In 1995, a volunteer investigator with a nonprofit contacted the family. He specialized in child abductions from the pre-DNA era and believed that Melissa's case bore resemblance to others of a woman using aliases to abduct toddlers for profit or adoption schemes. His files were extensive, but inconclusive. He told the family, "Sometimes the paper trail vanishes because someone made sure it did." The line stayed with them. By the early 2000s, Melissa's mother was in her 50s, her health declining, but her persistence unchanged. She had outlasted every detective who had ever worked the case. On her dresser sat a box of clippings, letters, and prayer cards. The note that had arrived in 1971, "She's alive, you're looking in the wrong place," was still there, edges curled, ink faded to gray. She passed away in 2016 without ever learning the truth. At her funeral, her children placed that note inside the coffin, tucked beside the photograph of Melissa in her white dress. They told themselves that if there was any justice, the message would find its way to her daughter, wherever she was. In the years that followed, one of Melissa's siblings, her sister Karen, began digitizing the family's archives. She scanned every clipping, every letter, every photograph. She uploaded them to online genealogy sites that had begun to incorporate missing person databases. At the time, she had no expectation that anything would come of it. She wanted only to preserve her mother's story before it vanished. But by doing so, she placed a fragment of Melissa's past into the same system that would one day find her. The next chapter of this story wouldn't begin in a police department or courthouse, but in an email inbox, one carrying a subject line that seemed too strange to be real. Possible DNA match, unknown relative. The email arrived on an ordinary afternoon in the spring of 2022, the kind of day that passes without incident. Gray sky, soft wind, no reason to expect that history would stir. The subject line read simply, "Possible DNA match unknown relative." It came from a company that processed consumer DNA tests, the kind that promise heritage maps and family tree discoveries. For most people, those notifications lead to casual curiosity, distant cousins, and names you've never heard of. But for Karen Turner, the eldest sister of a girl who had vanished in 1971, those words struck like a pulse under ice. She had uploaded her DNA months earlier to preserve their lineage, to anchor her mother's side of the family tree. Now, A match had appeared close, immediate, and impossible. The system predicted a parent-child or sibling-level relationship. Karen stared at the screen, reading the percentage twice, then again. It was not a distant connection. It was blood. She clicked the profile and saw a name she did not recognize. A woman living in South Carolina, aged 52. The photo was small, a smiling face in warm light. The woman's name meant nothing to her, but the algorithm's estimate of 49.8% shared DNA did. Karen whispered it aloud. It can't be. She waited 2 days before writing a message. Her hands trembled as she typed, deleting and rewriting, searching for the right words that wouldn't sound delusional. Hello, my name is Karen Turner. I recently received a DNA match that suggests we may be closely related. I'm not sure if this is an error, but if you're open to it, I'd like to understand how our families connect. Then she paused, added one more line, and hit send. My sister went missing in 1971. Hours turned into days with no reply. She told no one, afraid to ignite false hope. She kept checking, watching the status icon message delivered. Nothing more. It was easier to believe that silence than to believe that the world was about to fold in on itself. But a week later, a reply came. Short, measured. I don't know of any connection. But maybe we should talk. Their first call lasted almost 3 hours. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Angela, raised in South Carolina, married, with 2 grown children. She said she had always known she was adopted but had few details. Her parents were deceased, and no records had ever been released. She had taken a DNA test out of curiosity to learn about her ancestry. I wasn't expecting any big surprises. She laughed softly. Now here we are. As the conversation deepened, Karen felt the strange gravity of something aligning. Angela's birth certificate had been issued in late 1971, 4 months after Melissa's abduction. It listed no hospital, no attending physician. The adoptive paperwork was notarized but lacked a state seal. Karen's throat tightened. "Do you have any baby pictures?" she asked. A few minutes later, an email arrived with attachments of faded Polaroids scanned into digital clarity. A baby sitting on a blanket, the curve of her cheek, the soft swirl of hair. Karen gasped. The resemblance to Melissa's toddler photos was undeniable. By the next morning, Karen called the Fort Worth Police Department. She was connected to the Cold Case Division, now managed by detectives who specialized in long-forgotten files. The case number 71 to 2038 still existed in their archives. Within a week, they had reopened the file. They contacted the FBI, which began coordinating with the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division to verify the identity of the woman who might, after 51 years, be Melissa Turner. Modern DNA testing no longer required faith. It required precision. Both women provided new samples, which were sent to Quantico for comparison. Analysts cross-referenced the genetic data with the original Turner family profile uploaded by Karen and her brother years earlier to the National Missing Persons database. The results took 17 days. On the morning of the 18th, Karen's phone rang. The detective's voice was steady but thick with meaning. "Miss Turner," he said, "the results are back. It's her. It's Melissa." Karen could not speak. The air left her chest as if the last 50 years had collapsed in one exhale. She managed only a whisper. "She's alive?" "She's alive," he said, "and she's been living under another name all this time." The news traveled like an aftershock through the Turner family. Cousins, who had grown up hearing bedtime stories about the sister who vanished, wept when they learned she had been found. Old neighbors called one another, disbelief lacing every sentence. Reporters began to reappear, first local, then national, drawn to the impossible symmetry of the story of a child stolen in 1971 and reunited in 2022 through the miracle of DNA. The details that followed were both extraordinary and ordinary. Angela, who now understood she had been Melissa all along, had grown up in a modest household in Charleston. Her adoptive parents had told her she was special, that she had been chosen. She had never questioned the absence of formal adoption paperwork, believing it lost in bureaucracy. Her childhood had been stable, unremarkable, and framed by Sunday church and coastal humidity. When she married in her 20s and had children of her own, she never suspected that another family, 1,000 miles away, still held her photograph in a drawer marked missing. When investigators began tracing the couple who had raised her, the paper trail ended in the late 70s. Both had died years earlier. There were no living relatives to question, no records of payment or transaction, and no direct evidence linking them to the woman known as Ruth Johnson. The working theory, pieced together from sparse clues, suggested a black market adoption, informal transfers common during the mid-20th century, often cloaked as private arrangements. But without surviving witnesses, certainty was impossible. For Melissa, the revelation was seismic. "I didn't know who I was," she told detectives. "Everything I thought was solid just cracked open. Yet beneath the shock, there was something else, a sense of clarity, as if her life had finally snapped into focus." She spent nights reading through decades of articles, trying to understand the story she'd unknowingly lived. "All those years," she later said, "my mother was out there praying for me, and I didn't even know her name." For Karen, the reunion was both joy and ache, a fulfillment tangled with regret. Their mother had died 6 years too soon to see her prayer answered. The thought of it haunted everyone. "She believed this would happen," Karen said. "She just didn't live long enough to witness it." In Fort Worth, the detective handling the reopened case placed the original missing person photo on his desk beside the DNA confirmation letter. It was a small act of symmetry, 2 eras meeting in paper and data. "You don't get endings like this," he said quietly to a colleague. "Not after 50 years. Not ever." The reunion was arranged for early July. Cameras would not be allowed. The family agreed that after everything that had been taken from them, this moment would belong to them alone. The reunion took place on a quiet Sunday morning in July, 51 years after the day Melissa Turner was carried out of her Fort Worth apartment by a stranger in white gloves. The location was chosen carefully, a modest community center on the outskirts of town, away from reporters, away from the noise of a city that had already taken too much from this family. The windows faced east, toward the rising sun, and for the first time in decades, light fell on a story that had lived in shadow. Karen arrived first, carrying the same photo that had been pinned to her mother's wall for half a century. It was creased and yellowed now, but the image of a smiling toddler with a bow in her hair still seemed to breathe. Her hand shook as she pressed it to her chest, whispering, "You made it home." Melissa walked in moments later. She was 52, her hair streaked with silver, her eyes soft but searching. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then Karen took a single step forward, and the distance of 51 years collapsed. They didn't speak at first. They just held each other. 2 lives, 2 timelines, and 2 halves of the same photograph, finally aligned. Tears soaked shoulders. Words found no place. The sound of their sobs was small and human, the sound of history exhaling. When they did speak, the first thing Karen said was not, "I missed you," or "I can't believe this," but she knew you were alive. Melissa closed her eyes and nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "I can feel it." Detectives and family members stood at a respectful distance, letting the moment belong entirely to them. In a corner, a counselor from the state's Victim Services Division quietly recorded observations for the official reunion report, part of the modern protocol in long-term missing person identifications. But this wasn't just another case. It was a resurrection. They sat together for hours, comparing stories, holding up old photos, and trading details from lives that had grown apart. Karen told her about their mother's annual vigils, the candles lit on every birthday, and the note that had arrived anonymously in 1971 that said, "She's alive." "You're looking in the wrong place." Melissa listened in silence, her hands trembling around a styrofoam cup of coffee. "She carried me every day of her life," she said finally, "and I never even knew to look back." The days that followed blurred with interviews, paperwork, and the strange administrative choreography of erasing a name from one system and restoring it to another. Officially, Angela Pierce ceased to exist. Her legal name was reinstated as Melissa Renee Turner. The Department of Vital Records reissued a birth certificate, this time with the correct date and parents. When the document arrived, Melissa held it for a long moment before whispering, "I'm home." But with the joy came an old, unhealed wound, the question that had haunted Fort Worth for half a century. Who was Ruth Johnson? The FBI reopened the parallel investigation, combing through archived records of missing children, unsolved abductions, and black market adoption rings active in the early 70s. The name Ruth Johnson appeared dozens of times in unrelated cases, used as an alias on rental forms, babysitting ads, and train tickets across the South. But the woman herself had never been identified. Handwriting analysts compared signatures. Nothing matched. In one Florida case from 1973, a woman fitting her description had been questioned for attempting to remove a child from a daycare, but she vanished before a warrant could be issued. That file, too, was stamped unsolved. The theory that emerged was grim. Ruth Johnson had likely been part of an informal network of middle-aged women who acquired infants or toddlers under false pretenses and sold or placed them for cash with couples unable to adopt legally. Many of those couples, investigators discovered, genuinely believed the children had been surrendered voluntarily. The transactions left no paper trail, only stories and scars. For Melissa, the investigation was surreal. "It's like reading about a crime that happened to someone else," she said during a debriefing. "I see my name in reports. I see my picture on posters. But it doesn't feel like me. It feels like someone I used to be." The detective nodded. "You were two people," he said quietly. "Now you get to be one again." Local news stations began covering the story in cautious segments. They showed faded clippings beside new photographs of Melissa smiling beside her siblings. The headlines called it a miracle reunion after 51 years. But the Turner family resisted the word miracle. To them, it wasn't luck. It was proof that persistence, faith, and science could outlast time itself. In her first public statement, Melissa thanked the police, the DNA lab, and the strangers who had prayed for her family over the years. But her final line became the one that echoed online. "I wasn't lost. I was waiting to be found." The internet did what it always does. It amplified, dissected, and mythologized. Comment sections filled with people claiming to remember Ruth Johnson, others speculating about networks and conspiracies. For the Turners, the noise was both a blessing and a burden. Reporters camped outside Karen's home, hoping for quotes. Strangers mailed letters, some supportive, some strange. The family stopped answering calls. They had already spent 50 years being questioned. They needed quiet to heal. Meanwhile, the FBI's Forensic Genealogy Unit continued its work. Using historical census data and overlapping aliases, they traced the possible Ruth Johnson to at least 4 states between 1968 and 1974. The last verified reference appeared on a motel ledger in Shreveport, Louisiana, dated February 1972, 5 months after Melissa's abduction. The room had been paid for in cash. No further trace was ever found. For the agents assigned, closure was out of reach. "She's gone," one of them said later. "Whoever she was, she's gone. But her shadow isn't." The Turners accepted that some answers would never come. They had already received the one that mattered most. At night, Karen sometimes dreamed of her mother sitting at the kitchen table, candle burning, whispering prayers. In those dreams, she wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling, as though she already knew how the story would end. Melissa began visiting Fort Worth regularly, slowly rebuilding connections to a family that had once been only names in a file. She stood in the doorway of the old apartment building where she'd last been seen, the hallway unchanged except for the color of the paint. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said softly. "It feels peaceful now." Before leaving, she placed a single white flower on the step and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." In the months that followed the reunion, Melissa Turner learned that coming home was not a single event, but a slow reconstruction of self. The newspapers had ended their coverage, the reporters had packed their cameras, and the city's brief fascination had faded into archive headlines. What remained was quieter, heavier, and far more personal, the work of fitting two lives into one. The first step was her name. Officially, she had reclaimed her identity. Birth certificate corrected, driver's license reissued, and Social Security updated. Yet every new document felt strange in her hands, like proof of someone she hadn't yet met. "It's my name," she said to Karen one evening, "but it still feels borrowed." Karen smiled softly. "Then you'll grow into it. You already are." Melissa spent weeks in Fort Worth that summer, rediscovering the geography of a childhood stolen before memory could form. She walked the sidewalks where her mother had searched, visited the church that had hosted the first vigils, and stood beneath the pecan tree behind the old apartment complex, a tree that had been young and thin in 1971, but now reached high over the courtyard. "It's strange," she said, looking up through the leaves, "to think the world just kept growing without me." The neighbors who remembered the case welcomed her with cautious awe. Some had been children themselves when it happened. Others had volunteered in the original search parties. They hugged her, pressed her hands, and told her how they had prayed for her mother all those years. One elderly man confessed that he had helped tack her missing posters to telephone poles when he was 20. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said. "The world doesn't usually give you endings like this." But endings rarely arrive cleanly. For Melissa, joy and grief moved side by side. She kept thinking of her mother, the years she had missed, the birthdays she had gone unacknowledged, and the candles lit by someone she could no longer thank. "Every memory they have of me," she said in an interview, "is from before I could remember anything myself. So their love is built on something I can't touch, and my guilt is built on something I didn't choose." Therapists who specialize in reunification cases describe this as genetic grief, the ache of belonging to two histories at once. Melissa threw herself into understanding it. She met with counselors, read studies, and spoke to other long-lost children found through DNA technology. In those conversations, she discovered that her story was not unique and that across the United States, similar reunions were quietly unfolding. Technology had become the new search party, combing through genetic code instead of soil and riverbanks. The magnitude of it hit her during a visit to the Texas State Missing Persons Clearinghouse in Austin. A detective there showed her a wall of case folders with hundreds of names still waiting for matches. "Each one of these," he said, "is another family waiting for their phone call." He paused, then added, "Your case is giving a lot of them hope again." She stood in front of that wall for a long time. "It's strange to be someone's hope," she whispered. "For so long, I was only someone's loss." National media began to revisit the Turner case that winter, but the tone was different now. Less sensational, more reverent. The headlines framed it as a story about persistence and science. DNA ends 51-year search for missing toddler. Faith meets technology in Fort Worth miracle. Yet what lingered beneath those words was something quieter, an acknowledgement that the story's true miracle wasn't the technology itself, but the endurance of a family that refused to let time erase them. Melissa agreed to a few interviews, but kept them measured. She spoke not of trauma, but of gratitude. "The woman who took me," she told one journalist, "made me forget where I came from. But the people who looked for me, they never forgot me. That's what saved me in the end." Her story began circulating in missing persons forums and genealogy communities, often cited as proof of what ordinary families could achieve with persistence and modern tools. Karen, once reluctant to speak publicly, began giving talks to advocacy groups about the importance of preserving DNA and family records. "Don't wait," she would say. Upload what you can. Sometimes the evidence that breaks a case is already in your home. A letter, a brush, a photograph. By 2023, their story had become part of a broader shift in the way cold cases were handled. Law enforcement agencies began partnering more directly with genealogical services, building bridges between personal data and criminal investigation. Melissa met with some of the scientists who had helped identify her, fascinated by how their algorithms could pull the truth from strands of code. "You made a machine find my mother's faith," she told one of them. "How do you even put that into words?" The scientist smiled. "You can't. You just do the math, and sometimes the math feels like grace." In Fort Worth, the city council quietly voted to dedicate a small plaque outside the old apartment building. It reads simply, "In memory of every missing child, and in honor of the ones who find their way home." Melissa attended the ceremony in silence, her hand resting on the polished metal. She placed a single white rose beneath it, the same flower she had left there the year before. Still, questions remained. Who had orchestrated her disappearance? How many other children had vanished under similar pretenses? Federal investigators admitted that the trail was likely gone for good. Too many files lost. Too many names faded into paperless systems. The Ruth Johnson alias appeared again in a 1972 adoption record out of Florida, but there was no way to prove it was the same woman. The case, officially, remained unsolved. Yet Melissa refused to let it become a symbol of mystery. "We already have the ending," she said. "The rest is just noise." She began volunteering with a national missing children organization, mentoring families still searching. Her message was simple: never assume time wins. "We used to think that after 20 years, the trail goes cold," she said in one session. "But now we know time doesn't erase the truth. It just buries it until the right tools come along." At home, she kept a small box of mementos: her mother's rosary, the age-progressed sketch from 1984, and the note that read, "She's alive. You're looking in the wrong place." It was brittle now, sealed in glass. She had it framed beside her DNA match certificate. The past and the present faced each other like mirrors. When visitors asked how it felt to live between those worlds, she would smile gently and say, "I'm proof that what you lose doesn't always stay lost. Sometimes it's just waiting for the world to catch up." By 2024, Melissa Turner had learned that healing was not a straight line. Every reunion carried an echo. Every question answered unearthed 3 more. Her life had become a strange fusion of past and present, one built from 2 identities that had spent 5 decades pretending the other didn't exist. The press had faded, but the legacy of her story had not. Across the country, detectives, genealogists, and families were invoking her name in new investigations. The Turner case, they called it a template for what patience, science, and faith could accomplish together. When Melissa walked through airports now, she often noticed the posters, faces of the missing, rendered with modern software, accompanied by a small QR code for DNA submission. Each one felt like a mirror. She always stopped, even if only for a moment, whispering a quiet prayer for whoever was still out there waiting. "Someone's always next," she told Karen one evening. "Someone's always one test away." Her newfound visibility drew unexpected letters. Some were from parents of missing children, others from adoptees who suspected their own beginnings had been blurred by time. They wrote to thank her, to confide in her, or simply to say, "Your story made me take a test." Many of those messages ended the same way: "You gave me hope." Melissa read them all. Some she answered, some she couldn't. "It's hard," she admitted. "I became a symbol before I figured out how to be a person again." For the investigators who had reopened her case, the momentum spilled outward. The Fort Worth Cold Case Division, once a neglected archive, received new funding. Dozens of long-dormant missing person files were digitized and cross-linked to national DNA databases. In 2024 alone, 4 identifications were made through methods inspired by her case. including two that had been cold since the 70s. Detectives began calling it the Turner effect. At Quantico, a small team of forensic genealogists used her case in training seminars. They played the 2022 call recordings between Karen and Melissa to emphasize how science without humanity meant nothing. "This is what closure sounds like," one instructor told his class. "Not the courtroom, not the lab. That moment right there." For Melissa, the work of integration continued quietly. She had lived 50 years under a different name, with a different family, and though her adoptive parents were long gone, their love was real too. She refused to rewrite that part of her story. "I can't resent them," she said in one interview. "They raised me, even if it started with a lie they didn't understand." Her capacity for grace surprised even those closest to her. Karen often said that if their mother were alive, she'd recognize that same calm resolve. "That's how we know she's truly her daughter," she'd say. "She forgives what broke her." In early 2024, Melissa was invited to speak at a symposium on forensic genealogy in Washington, D.C. It was her first time addressing a room of scientists, detectives, and advocates all at once. She began her talk with a sentence that silenced the room. "I'm standing here because my mother never stopped believing, and because someone taught a computer how to listen." Then she told her story, not as a victim, but as a bridge between eras. "This isn't about miracles," she said. "It's about memory and math, finding each other in the same sentence." Her words became the symposium's refrain. Within months, new funding was approved for a federal initiative that would pair missing person files with consumer genealogy platforms, a partnership built on voluntary consent and strict privacy guidelines. The proposal cited Melissa's story as its moral compass. Meanwhile, back in Texas, she and Karen continued their quieter mission. They started a nonprofit called the Homeward Registry, dedicated to connecting families separated by time, bureaucracy, or deception. Its logo, a simple open door framed by light, appeared on everything from social posts to courthouse pamphlets. Within its first year, the organization helped 5 families identify missing relatives, 3 through DNA and 2 through archival research. Each success felt like a small repayment to the universe. "Every person found," Melissa said, "is another candle lit for the one still waiting." Her home became a place of quiet rituals. On August 23rd each year, the anniversary of her disappearance, she lit 2 candles, one for the girl she had been and one for the woman who had found her. "Both of them survived," she'd say. On her desk sat the only photograph that linked those 2 versions together, a digital reconstruction showing her toddler face fading into her adult one. "That's my timeline," she said softly. "It's finally whole." The city of Fort Worth, once defined by the unsolved mystery, now regarded her with pride. In 2024, she was honored at the annual Police Foundation dinner for contributions to justice through endurance. The citation read, "For reminding us that silence is not the same as absence." But beneath the recognition, Melissa remained private. She avoided interviews that sought drama and refused documentaries that wanted tears on cue. "It's not about tragedy anymore," she said. "It's about endurance, about what survives." Her story began to ripple through other cases. In Louisiana, a woman identified her sister after 60 years. In Oregon, a man discovered his brother through a match on a genealogy site. Reporters began calling it the era of the long returns. Melissa watched each announcement quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying. "Every time someone finds home," she told Karen, "it's like hearing an echo of my mother's prayer." As 2025 began, she returned once more to the old apartment building on East Rosedale Street, the place where her story had paused for 51 years. The plaque the city had installed gleamed under winter light. She brought her grandchildren this time, holding their hands as she told them the story in simple terms. "This is where a promise began," she said, "and this is where it kept itself." The children listened wide-eyed, their small fingers tracing the engraved letters of her name. One of them looked up and asked, "Grandma, were you scared?" She smiled. "I was too little to be scared. That part came later. But I wasn't alone. Not really." When they left, she looked back one last time. The building was quiet, the street still. For a moment, she imagined her mother's voice in the wind, not pleading, not broken, but whispering a thank you to the world that had finally answered her. And somewhere, in another family's home, another DNA kit waited in its envelope, ready to do what Faith had begun. By spring of 2025, the Turner case had become a point of reference in conferences, classrooms, and documentaries about the rebirth of cold case investigation in the age of genetic truth. Journalists and criminologists alike began to call the movement she inspired the Age of Remembering. It wasn't just about science. It was about the collision of persistence and possibility, about ordinary people who refused to let history end unfinished. Melissa often said that technology hadn't solved her story alone. "The data didn't find me," she told an audience at a university panel. "It just confirmed what love had been saying for 50 years. Her words carried weight because they came without performance. She wasn't selling anything and wasn't chasing attention. She was simply a woman who had lived through the silence and come back fluent in both loss and gratitude." Reporters noticed her stillness and the way she paused before answering questions, as if each sentence deserved to be tested for truth before being released into the air. "I don't want to tell a story of miracles," she said once. "I want to tell a story of math that learned how to care." That line spread through online communities that tracked missing person breakthroughs. Advocates began quoting her in newsletters and podcasts. Math that learned how to care became a quiet slogan for those who believed that data, when guided by empathy, could heal rather than just expose. Law enforcement agencies, many of which had ignored cold cases for decades, began dusting off boxes long buried in evidence rooms. A detective from Arizona said it plainly: "If Fort Worth could get their little girl back after 50 years, we can look again, too." Inez Towles. The ripple effect was measurable. Between 2023 and 2025, over 300 unidentified person cases were resolved nationwide through forensic genealogy, the largest wave of closures since the 70s. In one press briefing, the Department of Justice credited the public's renewed faith in long-term investigation, citing the Turner case as a cultural catalyst. "This is what perseverance looks like when paired with progress," the director said. For Melissa, those numbers meant something deeply personal. "Each statistic is someone's candle finally being blown out," she said. "A family that can sleep." Still, the emotional cost of visibility lingered. Not all responses were kind. Some critics accused her of romanticizing tragedy, of turning private pain into a public symbol. Others doubted the official narrative, insisting that too much had been left unexplained about her abductor, the mysterious Ruth Johnson. Melissa read those comments occasionally, mostly out of curiosity. "People are uncomfortable with loose ends," she told Karen. "But life doesn't always file reports. Sometimes it just leaves open doors." She handled her new public role with grace but guardedness. Each month brought new requests for documentaries, podcasts, and scripted adaptations. She turned down nearly all of them. "Stories like this don't need a soundtrack," she said. "They just need to be remembered." The Homeward Registry continued to grow. What began as a local nonprofit became a national database linking families, DNA labs, and investigators. Their website was simple: a beige page with a lantern logo and the words, "Every story deserves its ending." They didn't sell anything. They didn't make promises. They simply kept the light on for those still searching. One afternoon in May 2025, Melissa visited the registry's small office on the outskirts of Fort Worth. She found a volunteer, a teenage intern uploading new profiles into the system. The girl looked up shyly. "You're her," she said. "The lady from the video." Melissa smiled. "I guess I am." The girl hesitated. My aunt's been missing since 1988. My mom says your story made her try again. Melissa nodded. Then that means we're already winning. That night, driving home along the same highway her mother once traveled searching for her, Melissa reflected on how strange time could be, how it could stretch and fold until decades felt like minutes. The city lights blurred against her windshield like strands of code, like memory itself rewriting its own syntax. She whispered a line she had repeated countless times. Some stories just wait for the right language to be told. The right language, it seemed, had finally arrived. Forensic genealogy had evolved from a niche curiosity to a national standard. Police academies began requiring basic training in genealogical research. State archives digitized thousands of evidence samples once thought useless. Families who had been dismissed as hopeless cases were suddenly receiving phone calls that began with the same sentence: "We have a match." In 2025, the state of Texas passed legislation mandating that all unidentified remains and missing person evidence older than 10 years be reanalyzed using modern DNA comparison methods. The bill's nickname in committee was Melissa's Law. When it passed unanimously, Karen attended the signing ceremony, holding the same faded photograph she had carried into police stations for half a century. Melissa stood beside her, tears glinting as flashbulbs clicked. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence was the testimony. Afterward, a reporter asked what she thought her mother would say if she could see this day. Melissa looked up toward the ceiling lights and smiled softly. "She'd probably tell me I'm late for dinner," she said. "And then she'd tell me she knew." That sense of quiet humor, the kind born of endurance rather than irony, reminded everyone why her story resonated. It wasn't sensational. It was ordinary people refusing to surrender to the impossible. It was the long sound of faith humming beneath the static of bureaucracy. As the year went on, Melissa's life settled into a pattern of gentle advocacy. She gave interviews only when the cause mattered. A scholarship fund for forensic students and a campaign for expanded DNA databases. She visited schools where children asked questions no adult ever dared to. "Why didn't she just come back sooner?" one boy asked. Melissa smiled sadly. Sometimes people don't know they're missing until someone calls their name. At the end of that visit, a teacher handed her a drawing a student had made. It showed a girl standing under a night sky, holding a small lantern. Beneath it were 5 words written in uneven pencil. "She came home by light." Melissa framed it in her office the next day. That phrase became her quiet mantra. She wrote it on postcards to families waiting for answers, on letters to lawmakers, and even on the corner of her journal pages. Home by light. It was what the search had always been. Not a hunt for revenge or explanation, but for illumination. Late one evening, while sorting old photographs, she found an image of herself as a young woman. The version raised under her false name was standing near a lake, smiling, unaware of the truth that would one day surface. She studied it carefully, then slipped it into the same frame as her baby picture. 2 lives, 1 timeline, no longer divided. Outside, the first fireflies of summer drifted past her window. For a moment, their glow looked like flickering candles, the same kind her mother used to light on the kitchen table every birthday that never came. Melissa whispered into the quiet, "We found the light, Mama." And for the first time in 51 years, the silence that answered her didn't feel empty. It felt complete. By the end of 2025, Melissa Turner's name had become shorthand for endurance, the kind of story that outlasts both its witnesses and its explanations. In academic papers, her case appeared not as a mystery, but as a transformation point, the moment when the past began talking back through data. Students in criminal justice programs studied her file alongside technical case studies. Ethicists debated the meaning of consent in genetic databases using her example. Documentary filmmakers used her photograph. Smiling softly beneath the caption, "Found after 51 years," as an emblem of what persistence could restore. For Melissa, all of this attention felt distant, almost unreal. "It's like reading an obituary about someone who's still alive," she said. They're talking about me, but not the me who goes to the grocery store or feeds the neighbor's cat. They're talking about a symbol. The idea of becoming a symbol unsettled her. She had never wanted her story to stand apart from others, never wished to be the miracle case. She wanted it to belong to everyone still searching for proof that time could bend without breaking. So, she did something few public figures would have done. She withdrew. That winter, she stepped back from interviews and advocacy circuits. She stopped accepting speaking invitations. The nonprofit she and Karen had founded continued its work under new leadership, but Melissa herself returned to a quieter life. "I've told my part," she explained to a close friend. "Now it's their turn to find theirs." At home, she began writing. Not a memoir, not a public book, just a private journal chronicling what it meant to live after being found. The pages filled slowly, her handwriting deliberate and small. She wrote about the sound of the first phone call from Karen, about her mother's prayers, and about the sensation of two identities merging into one. Some entries were philosophical, others ordinary grocery lists beside lines of quiet revelation. Memory is a kind of geography. You can move back into it, but you can never rebuild it exactly. Each morning, she walked the same 2 miles through her neighborhood, noting how the light changed with the seasons. "I missed half a century of mornings," she told Karen once, "so now I count them." In the background, her case continued to ripple through the justice system. The Texas Forensic Institute launched the Turner Archive Initiative, a project that digitized every unsolved missing child case from 1950 through 1980. Analysts began cross-referencing biological evidence with genealogy databases worldwide. Within months, 2 other long-cold disappearances were resolved, both directly linked to methods pioneered in her case. The media called it the Turner Chain. At a national law enforcement symposium, a senior FBI official summarized it succinctly. "Every solved case is a conversation between the living and the lost." Melissa Turner taught us how to listen better. Even the language of investigation began to shift. Detectives stopped using phrases like time barrier or beyond recovery. They started saying data horizon, the idea that new technologies could always push the limit of what was knowable. Melissa's story had expanded the horizon itself. Meanwhile, genealogists noticed a cultural shift. Tens of thousands of people began submitting DNA samples not for ancestry curiosity, but to help close cold cases. For the first time in history, a social trend was driven not by entertainment, but by empathy. One genealogy company issued a public statement crediting the compassion shown by families who never stopped searching, naming the Turner case as the model for what they called citizen restitution. Through it all, Melissa watched from the quiet safety of her home. Her presence felt but unseen. She received occasional letters, some from law students, others from parents who had found missing children of their own. One in particular arrived on a rainy October morning. It came from a woman in Kansas City who had located her brother after 40 years. The letter read, "I thought I was writing to thank you, but really I'm writing to tell you that your story became our map. You taught us how to wait without giving up." Melissa kept that letter folded in her wallet. "It's strange," she told Karen later, "how the word wait can turn into faith if you hold it long enough." As the anniversary of her rediscovery approached, Fort Worth prepared a commemoration ceremony. The city planned to rename a small park near her childhood neighborhood, the place where the first search parties had gathered in 1971, as Turner Memorial Park. When the mayor called to invite her, she hesitated. "I'm not sure I belong on a sign," she said. The mayor replied, "It's not about fame, Melissa. It's about closure, not just for you, but for this town." I did mile. She attended quietly, dressed in simple navy blue. The crowd was small, a mix of officials, neighbors, and families of other missing persons. Reporters stood at a distance, respecting her wish for minimal coverage. When it came time for her to speak, she stepped to the microphone and said only this: "This place once held fear. Maybe now It can hold hope instead. Thank you for giving my mother's prayers somewhere to rest. Applause rose softly, like wind through the trees. Afterward, children played on the swings, their laughter filling the space where panic once lived. Melissa sat on a nearby bench, watching them, a faint smile tugging at the edges of her face. That's the sound, she whispered to herself. That's the one we waited for. In that moment, she realized something profound. She was no longer the missing person in her story. She was its witness. The roles had reversed. The lost child had become the guardian of other people's hope. Later that evening, she walked home alone through the cooling air. Streetlights flickered against the damp pavement. In one hand, she carried a small stone she'd picked up from the park. A reminder, solid and unassuming, of where absence once began. At her kitchen table, she placed it beside her framed DNA certificate and her mother's rosary. The past, the proof, and the prayer are finally together. As she turned off the lamp, she noticed how the three objects cast overlapping shadows on the wall, forming a shape that almost looked like wings. She smiled and whispered, "That's close enough." For the first time in her life, the darkness around her didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like what it truly was, the other half of light. 51 years after her disappearance, Melissa Turner's story no longer lives in newspaper archives or police binders. It breathes in real time, here in 2025, through every conversation about faith, evidence, and what persistence can recover. She isn't a ghost from a black and white photo anymore. She's a living woman who gets her mail, tends to her garden, and answers the phone when reporters still try to ask her what it feels like to be found. "I don't think of it that way," she tells them now. "I was always somewhere. The world just took a long time to notice." Her house sits on a quiet street in Fort Worth, a few blocks from the park renamed in her family's honor last spring. The plaque at its entrance reads, "Turner Memorial Park for every family that waited longer than time allowed." Melissa walks there most mornings. She carries a thermos of coffee and sits on the same bench that faces the swings. Children laugh in the distance, their voices spilling across the field where volunteers once gathered with lanterns and dogs. The city finally replaced the old park lights last year, so at dusk, the entire stretch glows amber, warm, forgiving, and alive. "I used to think I wanted answers," she said during a community talk in January. "Now, I think I just wanted light." Her life has become quieter since the reunion in 2022, but not smaller. She works part-time at a library downtown, cataloging microfilm reels of old newspapers, some of them carrying her own headlines. She doesn't hide from them. She slides each frame gently under the viewer's lens, checks the alignment, and whispers, "We're still here." And where? The library staff, mostly younger archivists, treat her with a kind of reverence that makes her laugh. "You're our reminder," one of them told her recently, "that a missing person file is just a paused story." Melissa smiled, touching the edges of a manila folder. "Then let's keep unpausing them." In March 2025, she helped open a small exhibition called The Unbroken Line, a collaboration between genealogists, artists, and local schools. The installation displayed thousands of connected paper strips, each one representing a DNA match that had led to a family reunion somewhere in the world. In the center hung a single red ribbon, labeled simply MT, 1971. It fluttered whenever the museum's air vents came on, as if breathing. "It's the only piece that's never still," the curator said. "We don't know why." Melissa smiled. "Maybe it remembers." Outside, the conversation about her case continues to evolve. Law enforcement agencies now cite the Turner Framework in procedural training, a standardized method for integrating genealogy data into cold case work. The National Missing Persons Bureau lists her as the first documented instance of a child found alive through multi-generational DNA triangulation. Her case sits at the top of PowerPoint slides, in FBI seminars and university ethics courses alike. But in her own words, the paperwork isn't the legacy, the people are. When reporters ask how she measures closure, She answers without hesitation, by the number of families who stop whispering their loved ones' names and start saying them out loud again. That's why she continues to work with the Homeward Registry, now a volunteer network spanning 12 states. Their current initiative, launched this year, aims to connect the thousands of John and Jane Doe profiles still sitting in storage to unclaimed family DNA. Every Thursday afternoon, Melissa sits in a conference room with technicians half her age, reviewing match reports on glowing monitors. She doesn't understand every algorithm or code, but she understands the silence between the lines, the gap each number represents. That's where the people live, she says softly, tapping the screen. In the spaces between. Her connection with Karen remains unbroken. The two women talk daily, sometimes about logistics for the registry, sometimes about nothing at all. They've both learned that healing doesn't require constant revisiting, only presence. Karen still keeps the faded photograph of 3-year-old Melissa in her wallet. Melissa keeps one of them together, taken just last month at the park bench. It's strange, Melissa said, to live long enough to become the proof. At a recent symposium in Austin, she was introduced as a guest of honor, though she insisted on sitting in the audience rather than on stage. When a young investigator presented a new case solved through family DNA, the room erupted in applause. Melissa turned to Karen and whispered, "That's the sound of the future catching up." Later, during a brief Q&A, someone asked her what advice she'd give to families still waiting. She paused before answering, her voice steady, her tone calm. "Keep everything," she said. "Every photo, every document, every feeling. The truth has a way of finding the smallest thread and pulling its way back to you." End quote. Those words would later appear on the registry's website banner, not as a quote, but as a quiet directive. Evenings in Fort Worth still end the same way they did before the discovery. Soft wind, porch lights, and the hum of traffic a few blocks away. But now, there's a different kind of sound, layered beneath the faint echo of a story that used to be unfinished. Melissa often sits on her porch steps, writing notes on yellow paper, fragments of thought, half-sentences, and questions that may never need answers. She folds them and drops them into a wooden box labeled "Ongoing." Sometimes she reads one aloud. What if the search never ends because it isn't supposed to? What if that's how we stay connected, by never fully closing the distance? Then she sets the box aside, leans back, and watches the Texas sky darken above her. The stars have always been there. She's just finally had time to learn their names. In 2025, Melissa Turner is not a mystery anymore. She is a map, a living record of how science and faith can meet halfway and recognize each other. Her story hasn't ended. It's teaching the world, quietly, that even in the longest silences, someone is still listening. The story of Melissa Turner doesn't belong to the past anymore. It lives in the present tense, in the hum of labs, still running genetic samples, in the conversations happening around kitchen tables where families decide to test, and in the quiet belief that a closed file isn't always the end of a story. Her name has become shorthand for endurance, for patience measured not in days or years, but in generations. In Fort Worth, the days unfold gently now. Melissa still lives in the same house she moved into 2 years ago, a modest bungalow with a front porch wrapped in ivy and an old rocking chair that creaks in rhythm with the wind. On most mornings, she waters the small rose bush by the steps, a gift from the Homeward Registry volunteers. Each bloom opens slowly in the Texas heat, white fading to pale gold. She calls it Ruth's Light, after her mother. Inside, her living room is lined with books, photographs, and a single framed quote on the wall. The truth doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right hands to find it. Visitors often pause there, reading it twice. Melissa smiles when they do. "That's all the advice I have left to give," she says. The work that began with her rediscovery hasn't stopped. In fact, it has grown louder, steadier, and more systematic. The Ruth Turner Forensic Center, dedicated in her mother's memory in February 2025, now serves as a hub for cold case genealogy across Texas. On the day of the ribbon cutting, Melissa stood beside Karen and the governor under a sky washed clean by early spring rain. She didn't make a speech. She just touched the plaque, the metal still warm from sunlight, and whispered, "We made it, Mom." Cameras caught her lips moving, but not the words. Since then, the center's database has already helped identify 3 missing persons. Each time a match is confirmed, Melissa receives a small envelope from the lab, a photo, a note, and the simple phrase, "Another family home." She keeps them all in a wooden box by her desk, stacked in order like chapters. "I don't reread them," she says. "I just count them." Her public appearances are rare now. She prefers smaller audiences, classrooms, workshops, and quiet church halls, where her story is less spectacle and more lesson. When she speaks, she does so softly, her voice steady, her phrasing deliberate. The science matters, but so does the waiting. One without the other never finds anyone. Younger investigators call her the bridge, the person who turned one family's heartbreak into a blueprint for others. At a 2025 conference in Dallas, a young forensic analyst told her, "Because of your case, we changed how we archive everything. We don't erase silence anymore. We store it until it speaks." Melissa nodded, eyes glinting. "That's what my mother did," she said. Her relationship with Karen remains the quiet heartbeat of her days. They share morning walks, grocery lists, and long silences filled with understanding. Every year, on February 22, the day Melissa was found, they drive to the park that now bears the Turner name. They light 2 candles on the bench, one white for the life lost, one blue for the life restored. They don't blow them out. They let the wind decide. In April 2025, a small documentary crew filmed an update for Homeward, Stories of the Found. The final shot showed Melissa walking down her street at dusk, the camera pulling back as porch lights flickered on one by one. Her voice came through in narration. "Maybe we don't solve mysteries. Maybe we just catch up to them." The producer later said it was the quietest closing line they'd ever recorded. At 66, Melissa still finds herself surprised by the ordinary. The hum of an air conditioner, the smell of rain on asphalt, and the laughter of children outside her window. All of it feels new, as though she's still learning how to belong to a world that once mislaid her. "It's strange," she told Karen one night, "to live as both the question and the answer." That line made its way into a magazine profile this year, beneath a photo of Melissa holding her mother's rosary. The article called her the face of modern hope, but she doesn't see herself that way. "I'm just what happens," she says, "when the right person keeps a file open long enough." And that truth, that stubborn endurance, has become the quiet core of her legacy. Across the country, families still reach out. Some write letters. Others send their DNA results, hoping she'll know what to do next. She tells them all the same thing: "You don't need to find me. Just keep the search alive. The road back home already knows your name." When the house grows still at night, Melissa sits on her porch and looks at the sky. The neighborhood hums softly around her, sprinklers ticking, cicadas droning, and dogs barking in the distance. Somewhere, she knows, another family is waiting. Another test tube traveling through the mail. Another silence about to break. If her story teaches anything, it's that even the smallest fragments of truth, a hair, a letter, or a trace of DNA, can move mountains when the right eyes finally see them. And for those of us listening now, in this present year of 2025, her voice carries beyond her own story. It asks the same question she began with all those years ago. What if the missing were never truly gone? What if they were only waiting for us to notice? If stories like this remind you that the truth can travel across half a century and still find its way home, and that faith and science together can rewrite what time tried to erase, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and follow as we continue to uncover the stories where silence isn't the end, but the beginning of discovery. Because somewhere out there, another name is about to surface, Another family is about to find light again. And when it happens, you'll want to be here to witness it.